Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, Science Fellow and Principal Atmospheric Scientist with Nutrient Ag Solutions. And in this forecast video here for Farm Credit Illinois, we're going to take a look back at what winter's given us so far and take that long-term look out through spring and summer. So let's dig right into this. Our first map here shows us what December delivered. And for many across the South, throughout the Midwest and the Mid-South, we had one of the warmest Decembers on record. In fact, many records that were broken were set back in the 1930s here. But as we all know, January took a different tone. Here's the temperature ranks by climate district for the month of January. We saw a lot of very cold air coming out of the northwest, and at times it was quite dry as well. But our temperatures here showing much, much colder than average conditions. For example, right here in central Illinois, out of 130 years of data, it was the 108th coldest. So big switchover. One of the big reasons for that was what the jet stream did. Produced a very large ridge of high pressure just off the coast right here. And that forced the air to flow something like this. And very few times do we actually get systems to come out of the southwest. That's been a major component missing in the flow of the jet stream this winter, what we call southwest flow. That southwest flow coming in this direction is what delivers us a lot of precipitation. You want a good example of that? Think of that big snowstorm we had at the beginning of February. That was when the jet stream finally dipped and came out of the southwest. Now, since we're talking about snow, I want to show you two maps here. Before we got that big snowstorm at the beginning of February, much of the state of Illinois was running a deficit on snow. In fact, there were several places right in through here, including this part of Indiana, that had yet to measure even a full inch of snow. We just had a lot of little dustings of snow and much, not much more than that. We'll take a look. If this was how things looked on January 31st, this was what happened on Friday, February 4th. So that includes that big snowstorm we had, from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. So take a look. There was before, and this is after. And many of those places across across Illinois that were sitting in major snow deficit look something like this now. So I pulled this off for Champaign, but what it shows you is this would have been the normal rate of accumulation of snowfall. Here, this line in the bottom is where we were, and then that one event took us right back up to the climatological average. But we got to look about this in a way that gives us an idea about the bigger picture. And I'm going to do that first by showing you the latest drought monitor. So this one was released on February 3rd. It still shows about 70 to 72% of the country in some form of drought. And what I get concerned about is how the drought monitor changes with time. If we take a look at that, let's just go back here and just look at the last 3 months. We've had drought expanding across a lot of the plains. Now, we start to think a lot about this because if that drought expands north, like toward South Dakota, or here toward Iowa, or into Missouri or Arkansas, and if by spring this area has expanded, we begin to worry about the eventual position of the jet stream. Because if it ends up having to run around this, well, that could spell drought issues for us going into our spring and summer for the state of Illinois. That's one concern I have. Another way to look at this situation is to look at the soil moisture values. Now, these are modeled soil moisture values. They come from NASA, and we're looking down here to 40 centimeters deep, that's 16 inches. And again, we can see the dry conditions here. Now, lately, this whole area has seen some improvement. Again, that was from that big storm system at the beginning of February. But northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, southern Michigan, Iowa, and then of course back here in the plains, there are several places that are very, very dry. In fact, if we just stitch together the whole of this cold, winter, let's start back on December 1st and go all the way to February the 6th, we can see that there's just a large area in through here that has missed out on a lot of that precipitation. Now, there is some snow in that area. In fact, let's blow this up so you can see it. There's the snow from the big winter storm. That's got to melt. But remember, snow contains 1/10 of the moisture that you'd get from the rain, right? Because there's a 10-to-1 ratio when you take rain and multiply it into snow. So some of this is going to melt, but it all depends on how much of it runs off to reviving what's going on with the current drought situation. Now, we're getting a bit of a lull in the near term here with our weather. This is just looking over the next 10 days. So this gets us out to about the 17th. And overall, during that time period, the jet stream, look, you can actually see it in the greens. It runs up into a large ridge here. And those troughs kind of pull into the east. And so there's going to be a lot of clipper systems that run eventually through the Great Lakes. But in this particular setup, when the jet stream's doing something like this, we tend to get what we call convergence in the flow. And convergence in the flow aloft produces higher pressure near the surface. So overall, this point through mid-February, we're looking for a drier time period. Now, we do need to be on the lookout for any system that could possibly sneak into this low pattern and dip to the south and then run up through the Ohio River Valley, because that could, of course, give us a better chance at precip. But none of the major global models are really picking up on that at this point. I'm keeping an eye on the weather patterns after Valentine's Day pretty carefully. Temperature-wise, look what that ridge is doing to the temperatures here, coming off the Rockies, clear into Canada. We've got a lot of warm air at times that's going to shoot out into this area, but we're going to be kept, generally speaking, on the colder side of things. And the reason why I got this colder bias in the forecast here is primarily because of the snow that's on the ground. I can tell you this, polar vortex is behaving this winter. It's very strong, very steady, sitting just north of Greenland, and it's not moving. Unlike a year ago where that sucker was unleashed and it was split and it was moving that cold air out of the Arctic, not the case this year. That's an important difference between now and 2021. So what are the big factors going into spring? Well, let's do this piecewise. I want to start north, right here. This cold water that you see in this area, and it's potentially positional shift a little bit farther toward the south off of California and the Baja. Now, what we call this particular ocean temperature configuration, where there's warmer water here, all right, and colder water here that kind of surrounds it, almost in a reverse C shape, we call that particular setup the negative phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And we've been observing it for a very long time. This is the time series. Now, I want you to look over here on the end of it, because if you notice, back from about 2005 to about 2013, it was negative. And then 2014, 15, 16, it was positive. And then now it's dipped negative again. Now, each time this flips around, we tend to have La Niñas that punctuate this. They tend to work together. But the point to show you here is that the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is quite negative right now. And we know historically what it does. Let's blow this up so you can see it. In February and March, when there is a negative PDO, you can kind of see, I'll just highlight it here, this region, see the blues that are in there? That region tends to have a higher chance at seeing above average precipitation. What I don't like about this is that it tends to be drier back here in the plains, drier in the desert southwest, drier in California, areas of drought we're concerned about right now. So could this lead to an active February and March in this area? It could, if the PDO is the more dominant signal. In fact, let's take a look at that. February to March, when the PDO is negative, there tends to be big ridges that move west. They're over here. Remember how in January the ridge was there? Not when you have the PDO taken over. And the flow likes to do that. So if you get a little southeast ridge, where does that jet stream come from? From the southwest. And that's why this area tends to go very active. But we have to ask, what and how long will that be the main component of the flow? Because it's not just the one piece. Go south of there, and we've got La Niña. Now this La Niña is fading, and as it fades, it lets this other weather factor called the MJO, which moves from Africa, over here in what we call phase 1, out into the central Pacific, which we call phase 8. And it moves all between this area and interacts with what's going on with La Niña. Now, just thinking about that, I want to let you know something. That La Niña is fading fast. Out here in what we call Niña region 3.4, that's the middle of the Pacific, it's actually been warming since the end of December. And this La Niña is going to continue to fade. We know something about La Niñas, okay? Where the La Niña right now has its greatest, coldest water is over there in what we call Niña region 1+2. That's by South America. You saw that right here, okay? Now, whenever we tend to get that being the focal point, this area tends to be active in terms of precipitation. We tend to be drier to our west. Remember, that's something that I'm watching very, very carefully. So is the National Weather Service. They have their seasonal outlook, which they released on January 31st, concern about drought expanding north here. And I get it. La Niña, negative PDO, that is a signal that we have to be on the lookout for. And remember, that's one of my concerns going into spring. But what do they have in terms of their forecast for the next few weeks? Because they released back on the 4th their outlook, at least through March the 4th. And we can see that, generally speaking, mainly because of a strong polar vortex and what's going on with the PDO and La Niña, they're going to say we're going to favor more mild days. But you live in Illinois. You know how this is going to go. We're going to get mild days followed by brutal shots of cold air. That's just how winter goes. They do not have us on the dry side of things. And this is interesting. They've got this region in through here with equal chances. No strong signal over for dry. So I'm going to compare that to something. Let's go compare it to the European model. Let's even go out farther. Let's take the end of February through March 21st. Now that gets us actually out to the spring equinox. And you can see this consistent story, right? That's the area that we see with above average precipitation. Now, if that precipitation comes in and loads our soil up with moisture, okay, maybe gets in the way a little bit of doing some spring work in our fields, but I like to pack the moisture in early so that we've got it in reserves for later. What I want to point out is, notice from Texas here into the southern plains, the models are favoring drier conditions for that area. Same thing for California, which had a great December, a terrible January and start to February. From there, I want to show you what this La Nina is going to do. Well, what it's not going to do. It's done. We see that the weather forecast models through spring bring our weakening La Nina back to neutral conditions by June and possibly into weak El Nino territory by the time we get out there into our summertime period. Now you can see that in the forecast. This goes all the way out to August. See the warm water showing up back in through here? That indicates the shift in the behavior of the trade winds, allowing for that warm water to slosh back and the cold water to slide into the southern hemisphere. But remember that PDO signal? That's the area right there I want to watch most carefully. Because if this area, and this is a big if this area goes over colder, the risk for summer drought in the Midwest increases. That's just it. That's the main point here. If this area goes over colder, the risk of summer drought in the Midwest increases. If the warm water you see here encroaches into this region and overtakes it, then the probability of the ridge setting up over the Midwest versus the West changes. And the West, therefore, has the highest chances of having the hot summer, the dry summer, and the drought-like conditions expanding. So we think about all of that and say, well, what are the models suggesting? Well, there isn't a model out there right now that is forecasting a cold spring. This is April, May, and June. The idea here that we would go into a cold spring just isn't showing up in any of the forecast models. But what about precipitation? Let's look at the seasonal precipitation outlook. It's no surprise that the models are keeping this area dry. You say, why? Well, they were initialized dry in that area. And so as a result, they tend to perpetuate that initialization. They keep going with what they started with. We can also see that this means a lot of the upper Midwest, including the state of Illinois, will likely have maybe a little bit wetter of a spring. But as we play this forward, as we get out there longer term, that's May, June, July. Let's just go on out there to June, July, August. You start to see that the models are like, well, wait a minute. There's a chance in here that we could be a little drier. And they're reflecting overall the shift out of La Nina to neutral, maybe even weak El Nino, but they're keeping an eye on that cold water that's in the Gulf of Alaska. And you see how it looks like a strong southwest monsoon and the flow where it tends to be wetter seems to surround this area? That's maybe a possible solution going into this upcoming summer time frame. Now, I think about all of that, and I have to remind everybody that's watching, these models are not perfect predictors. They have their biases. They almost always bias things too dry because you got to remember, it's summer. Most of what will come in here in the way of precipitation will be from thunderstorm complexes. And also, I just need to think about this with respect to some longer-term trends. I think we'll finish up there. This is what things look like. I went to one of my favorite websites from NOAA called Climate at a Glance. I looked at the 3 months ending on June. Okay, so this is April, May, and June. And overall, here we go, for the state of Illinois, we've seen an increase to the tune of almost an inch a decade increase in precipitation, but a lot of variability. Now, the last time we had a dry spring, okay, was back here in 2016, and we still had great summer precipitation after that. So beyond this, really, you have to go back to 2012 before we were way below the climatological average. Nearly every spring in the last decade has had near normal to above normal precipitation. That's a longer term trend we got to keep a close eye on. But what I want to tell you all is this. Keep an eye on those ocean temperatures. Let's watch to see how the drought area expands, if it expands, in the central plains. If we erase that drought and those ocean temperatures warm up, this looks to be shaping up like a great year. But we do have the things we need to keep an eye on. We're also keeping a close eye on South America. And if you're interested in seeing that kind of content, which we did include in today's video, I'll be sure to give you this link right here where you can sign up for my daily reports. And I'll make sure and cover that every single report I produce. So I appreciate your attention. Have a good rest of February and a good start to this upcoming growing season. And we'll talk again soon. Thanks.